Hey, and welcome to Neverwinter with Aragon. So with Module 22 we have a new enchantment rework, and I'd like to go over my build for this upcoming module. Now this will be with only one piece of new gear from the new module, so it will become a little bit outdated in that terms when we can actually access this new mythic gear. Anything else from the new zone, all of this stuff, I have looked through, even these new rings, and we can see that all of it's nowhere near as good as the stuff we already can obtain, excluding this new shirt, which I'll get to when I go over my gear. Now first things first, just so you know that I know somewhat what I'm talking about, we can see that I can deal a fair amount of damage in this new trial, and this will be the main basis around which this build is for, the new trial, but also it's going to cover you in terms of having a good build for those boss fights. And you can see we can deal a considerable amount of DPS, which is damage per second, meaning if we look at this value, I'm dealing on average 544,000 damage every second, right? So that adds up to a considerable amount during your phase within your boss fight, and we can see that throughout all of these screenshots here. So let's start things out with our powers. Now we're a rogue, so we have a unique setup to all the other classes, but otherwise this build will cover any of the other melee physical DPS classes. So initially our primary at-will is going to be Duelist Flurry. It can hit in rapid succession. You can hit about 5 times a second, and this is a huge benefit for us as a class. It will also cause you to add bleed effect, which can stack up again. And if we look here, you can see on this act log, our bleed damage is up to 13% of our overall damage. That's pretty massive there. As for our secondary at-will, well, you could use Gloaming Cut. I'm still considering whether it's worth it or not, because sometimes the boss will phase, do some mechanics, and you can't be right next to them. So then we want a ranged power, and this will be our only ability, which is Cloud of Steel. You'll be able to hit something that's within a range of 50 feet, and it does hit pretty rapidly every second. But again, ideally you want to be using a Duelist Flurry pretty much non-stop. Gloaming Cut you could use during a very end phase of a boss when you've got him below 50% HP. Then this thing starts racking up the damage there by a whole ton, up to 100% more magnitude on it, be up to 300. That's huge. Now we go to our encounter powers, and our primary ability here will be Wicked Reminder to increase the damage on all of our attacks for 10 seconds. And with this having a 15-second cooldown, there should only be a 5-second window where you don't have this active. You can see if you use it when you're stealth, you will also reduce the target's critical avoidance. And then our massive hitting encounter power is Assassinate. It has up to 854 magnitude, which can deal up to 25% more damage when you make sure you hit from behind the target. And then we have Lashing Blade, just for that 715 magnitude damage. If you've got your critical severity capped at 90%, then casting from the stealth becomes pretty much pointless. Then with our daily powers, you'll generally be using Shocking Execution during your artifact calls, just to buff this to all hell and deal a ton of damage. Keep in mind of the added effect whenever you hit the target which is below 20% hit points, you will automatically refill half of your action points. As your secondary daily, you could use like Bloodbath. If you time it right during some phases like in Tower of the Mad Mage, you can become immune to damage. So you could use it as a backup survivability tool if you're absolutely in need of doing so. Otherwise, Shocking Execution is your focus. We just have 3 mechanics on this class. We have the shift is our roll. You can get those immunity frames nicely. You can dodge pretty far. We have our stealth, which whenever you go invisible, whenever you hit things, you will automatically deal combat advantage damage. Normally you can just flank the target and also deal combat advantage damage. And whenever you leave that stealth, as we can see down here, you gain 10% more damage for 5 seconds. Then with our class features, I generally go with Invisible Infiltrator and Oppressive Darkness. You absolutely want Oppressive Darkness. As we can see here, it's about 3% of my overall damage. Not the best, but every little helps there. This Invisible Infiltrator you could swap out to Tactics if you need action point gain, or if you're missing some crit chance, you could even use Skillful Infiltrator, especially if you want that added effect of movement speed. And finally we go to our feats. In the first set you want Toxic Blades to get that dot. Second set you want Master of Shadows to be able to generate that stealth a lot faster. It's very good when you get hit a lot in, let's say, a trial. and then you can still make sure you have that stealth to be able to cast your said powers from stealth. Third set, you want Skullcracker for that added 10% more damage. Our fourth set of feats, you want Back Alley Tactics to give you that 10% more damage when your action points are at nothing. And lastly, you want Shadow's Flurry to have that chance to spawn a shadowy figure, which will use the final combo of Duelist Flurry on the target. So lastly, with our powers, I'd like to go over the rotation. How do you want to set this up? And let's head to the dummy. Now, when you're in group content, you should be organized enough that you will all use your artifacts, mount powers, daily powers all at the same time. You'll ideally want, let's say like Demogorgon's Reach, an artifact would increase everybody's damage. Now, if you're a bit selfish, you could use even the Envenomed if people aren't that coordinated and don't mind you using a personal buff artifact. And initially what you would do is you would cast that artifact, go in stealth, use Wicked Reminder, then cast your daily power, then go in stealth again, cast your Lashing Blade, use your daily power and use your Assassinate. And that would be your entire rotation. Of course, you would throw in the Hunting Hawk in the middle of that as well to gain that extra damage. Now, you want to do all of that within the 10-second window after you've cast Wicked Reminder from stealth. And the reason you do this is you gain 10% from Wicked Reminder, you'll gain 10% more damage from leaving stealth after you've cast it, so that means your next power has a 20% damage buff. That's why you use your Shocking Execution. Now after you've done so, you have another 5% damage increase along with your stealth meter completely fulfilled. So with that, you'll go and cast your Lashing Blade from stealth. That will refresh that 10% bonus after leaving stealth. And then you use your mount power, which you should then have a 10% buff from Wicked Reminder, a 5% buff from casting your daily power, another 10% buff from casting Lashing Blade from stealth. And those all add up to make sure that your mount power with 3000 magnitude is hitting like a truck. And lastly, you cast the Assassinate and still again try and have that cast within the 5 seconds of that leaving stealth and within the 10 seconds of Wicked Reminder. You'll get faster and faster to make sure you can chain them all together nice and quickly. So again, on screen here, it's Wicked Reminder from stealth, daily power, Lashing Blade from stealth, mount power, and then Assassinate. And you can throw in your Hawk wherever you want in the rotation. I generally throw it in the end just because it can sometimes be a little bit annoying to cast and then you might miscast it. And then at least you haven't wasted time in the middle of the rotation to make sure it actually gets cast. So next up, we're going to move to our statistics that we want to be capping on our rogue. What's our priority? Well, initially when we go and use some buff food, my stats will look as such. Now I have gear and so on, which I'll go over in a little bit. That will give me even more stats. And what you want to focus on primarily is power and combat advantage. And then after that, you focus on crit strike and crit severity. And lastly, you use accuracy as your dump stat when you've managed to cap the other statistics. In the new trial, right now, it doesn't seem you will need any particular defensive stats to go out of your way to sacrifice offensive stats for defensive stats. Now the difficulty might change and we might have to actually stack some defensive stats to be able to survive a bit better. Right now, we can completely focus on offensive stats and maximize our damage. Now, of course, item level is another big factor that will affect our overall damage. Keep that in mind when you're choosing particular gear pieces. So now we'll move on to what gear you should be using. You can see I'm using the Gristral Horns, which will give me up to 10% critical strike. I'm using the Bone Devil's Ribcage, which will give me up to 25% statistics, half of that being critical strike and half of that being critical severity. I'm using the Crag Scalers, which gives me 5% power and 5% awareness. I will lose a chunk of movement speed, but in the trial it doesn't really seem to matter too much. And finally, with the Wasteland Wanderers, I gained 5% more combat advantage when I'm nice and close to my target. And with those gear pieces, we can enter combat here, and this is what my stats are looking like. Very nice. We're pretty much capped out on power, 0.1%, capped out on combat advantage, nearly capped out on crit strike, 0.2% missing, and crit severity 9%. Of course, my build, you could do a bit of tweaking here and there, and if you want to copy it identically, you can, and this is what results you should end up with. So our stats are looking pretty neat while in combat. Now for your weapons, you ideally want the Mirage weapons. they have the ability to summon those clones, which will cause some more damage. Now I'm in the process of testing and I need to check in the trial whether Lionheart might be a little bit better. Not entirely sure, and we still don't know what the new trial weapons will be as well. So Mirage might at some point get outdated, but right now I feel they're still one of the best weapon sets to be using on a rogue. Then for our neck, waist and artifact, we're using the Demogorgon set. It gives you that 5% consistent damage buff, and also having the added effect of being able to proc off a little bit to give you 150 magnitude damage hits, which only scales off item levels sadly. And we can see here Demogorgon's Wrath absolutely much less than 0% of our overall damage. It was only dealing 384 in counter DPS compared to our overall 544,000. And you can see the artifact there is the Demogorgon's Reach, which completes the set there. Now for our rings, for the new trial, we're using this 10% damage to undead because it works, and that's a 10% damage buff. That's pretty massive. Alternatively, you could use a ring that would buff up your melee damage, like 3% there. And alternative to that, again, you could use the Red Eyes Glare to give that 5% power and 2.5% accuracy. Now you absolutely want a Band of Air as well to go with this entire build. Without it, you will absolutely lose a big chunk of your damage. Again, looking at that chart, you could see that Touch of Wind, which is the Band of Air, was about 11% of our overall damage. That's a pretty big chunk. So without it, you lose a lot in this build, and without Touch of Wind, you're more incentivized to use Gloaming Cut a lot more often and stagger it between Duelist Flurry. Make sure your bleed is up and then use Gloaming Cut. And if your bleed expires, you're using Duelist Flurry again, and it's a balance between that. Now with the Band of Air, we can keep going with the build exactly what I have. Then with our shirt, we're using a new shirt, which is a corroded shirt of the Dragon Cult. Now if we look in this new zone, we can see there's a lot of those shirts about, and you can see them down here. Here's one of them that gives outgoing healing, but you want to be getting once that combat advantage. That's this torn shirt, and it's also this corroded shirt. Now you will lose control resistance, which actually might be a negative thing in the new trial since there's a lot of pushback effects, but I'm not sure they're actually affected by control resistance at all. Still something I'm checking out. And for our trousers, we're using these velvet pants. There is another version of them, but they're from Professions, and they basically give you offensive stats as pants, which is great, and also give you ability to gain more action points once every 5 seconds while in combat. And that's it for the gear. However, now we have our enchantments. You can see I'm mainly using 3 Jade enchantments. These are the new ones, which give 1,500 item health. And then I'm using 1 amethyst one with the combat advantage. Defense, I'm just using defensive ones, which are just these garnets. They're pretty neat there. And utility, we're also using a garnet for the Forte. And for our combat enchantment, we're using the Poison Thorn. Now the damage from Poison Thorn is very small. You can see that's it there, and it was only 2% of our overall damage. But the big benefit of Poison Thorn is it can hit a lot, and it can actually proc the Touch of Wind a good bit more often. So that's extra damage right there, and the ability to give 5,000 item level is nearly 10% damage, along with it just having on equip 10% damage, so it's absolutely a must with this build. And then as our bonus, we're using recharge speed. Back to gear, we go to the modifications. You can see on our armor, headpiece got crit strike, chest pieces got crit strike, arms pieces got crit strike, and boots have got power. For our weapons, you can see here we're using the Duelist Flurry. We got to enhance that, that's great. And for our offhand, we have our recharge speed along with our critical strike. Instead of recharge speed, again, you could take action point gain if you really need it, or like crit severity, but not the best there. And then for our neck, waist and rings, you can see we're just using the combat advantage jewels there. Ideally use the 880 ones. So then we go and move on to our actual artifacts, and you can see I'm using the envenomed, the flayed, and also the frozen as my 3 main artifacts, completing the set with the Demogorgon's Reach. The Storyteller Journals will give you that extra damage whenever you critically hit, and also the 0.54% power and some max HP, which is pretty neat, and they're like the best to use. However, in a trial, if you're going to be using any artifact other than, let's say, the Frozen or the Demogorgon's Reach to buff up your party's damage, then having the Storyteller Journals is pointless, and you're better off with artifacts that have 1,200 item level level, like the Demogorgon's Reach, and on top of that you can get the new ones from Echoes of Prophecy. In the first part you would get the top one here with the Neverwinter Standard, that's at 1200 item level, and down here the Jewel of the North, 1200 item level, and you use those instead of the Storyteller Journals if you can't run 3 Storyteller Journals. As for what race to use as a rogue, well, I have made a tier list on what races to choose, and we can see that yes, indeed, the Metallic Ancestry Dragonborn and the normal Dragonborn are one of the best, including the Gith. Now, all of those are locked races, and they're all premium. So unfortunately, anybody who wants to play like free to play or doesn't want to invest anything into their race, you won't be able to use those. And the next up contender, I believe, is like the Wood Elf with the Critical Strike, and also the Half Orc or the Tiefling. The Tiefling will give you additional damage up to 5% when your target's health is below half. It's pretty neat, but not so great for AoE, and the Half Orc gives crit severity. And we go to our ability scores. You want to keep that in mind when also you're choosing a race. You ideally want to focus on strength for the extra physical damage boost, and charisma for that extra forte and recharge speed. Now we go to our companions, and this is the setup I'm using for single target boss fights. So this is the entire build. I'm using an owlbear cub purely for the enhancement power of bonus accuracy, combat advantage, and crit severity. We're getting a total of 7,500 of each of those statistics, adding up to 22.5 thousand of those ratings, which is 22.5% statistics, if you can actually make use of them. Make sure your stats aren't red, and otherwise you can absolutely use an active companion. The way I've tested it out and seen how it was is that you're better off using an active companion like the Pseudo Dragon for your damage if you're not hitting over that 500,000 encounter DPS on a dummy. You can use the combat tracker to have a look at that for yourself on your own build. So we're just using the owlbear cub. In solo content, you absolutely want an active companion just to give you combat advantage. As for equipment, you can see I'm using 2 critical severity ones. These ones are from the Redeemed Citadel. You ideally want the ones from Sharandar for a bit more item level, and also a critical strike one there. And that companion enhancement then, of course, on Mythic. Then for our equip powers, we're using precision here to give us that critical strike, 7.5% of it. Using the bigger they are to get 8.6% extra damage on bosses. Batiri for 11% damage on bosses. Neverwinter Knight, 7.5% extra damage. And then the Alchemist for that crit chance and that combat advantage. And I don't expect everybody to have a golden cat. So instead of that, you could use, if we switch these equip powers, we can see we can slot in the relatively cheap Staldorf companion. And it gives the same as the golden cat, 7.5% combat advantage. And we get that to 85%, which we get to 90% just with those boots whenever we're in combat and close to our target. And that's that for companions. Now we move on to our mount, and we have in our stable here Golden Touch. You could use the Giant Toad's Tongue Slash from the Giant Toad mount, and you could also just use Tunnel Vision from like any of those other mounts that would have it. You can see Tunnel Vision up to 3000 magnitude. We're using Ferocity in our equip power, and this is because, again, this can proc the Band of Air a good bit more often, about 30% or so. Alternative to Ferocity, if you're not running group content, which with this build you should be, you could run with, in my build, Accuracy. We just give 4.5% there. We can fit that in since we only have the rating of 68,000 accuracy. So if you don't have the Band of Air, then make sure to take the Accuracy instead of Ferocity. The extra damage from it is very minimal. It's next to nothing, and you're better off with Accuracy than this if you don't have the Band of Air. We go to the stable, and you can see this is my setup. We're mainly just using Brutality and Dominance insignias, and with that we're using 2 Assassin's Covenant and 3 Gladiator's Guile. Now you could use one of the other insignia bonuses that, let's say, give you the Combatant's Maneuver, giving you 2,500 combat advantage whenever you control an enemy. Usually when you're hitting somebody, it's considered as controlling. As for my collars, we can see we're running a practical, doesn't matter which one you run there. We're using a movement speed one. We're running a crit severity one. We also have an encounter power damage one, and we also have a stamina gain one. And if we look at our damage chart here, we can see that Duelist Flurry is actually our top contender in damage, which is 14%. That is followed by Assassinate, our Bleed. So if we consider our Bleed as at-will damage, that's 27% from at-wills. And we add in Assassinate, Lashing Blade, and Wicked Reminder, and we just end up with 28% damage from our encounter powers. So it's tit for tat, and it pretty much doesn't matter which one you use. At will or encounter power damage works both ways. And that's it for those mounts. Next up we go to our boons, and this is the setup. You just want all those offensive stats. You want to make sure you pick up these different benefits here, like 5% damage versus dinosaurs versus fiends, depending on what content you're running. But with this new trial, you absolutely want the 5% damage versus your undead, since that's what the dragon is. You also might want some control resistance, depending on whether that works. And of course the movement speed. On the top, we're running with Forte, and also that reach out speed. And at the very top, we're running with Bloodlust. It'll give you that extra damage hits. But again, you can see it's pretty minimal, but it is adding up to just over 1% of our overall damage. It does have an added effect that it can reduce the enemy's defense, which should mean everybody else can deal more damage to the target. For our guild stronghold, we're running with our crit strike, just some defense, and utility. For a trial, you ideally want revive sickness. As for our consumables, what we use to get to these statistics, well, you can see we are using watermelon sorbet, and this is the older version of it. It's the version that gave 10% power and 10% accuracy. If you're going to be using the newer watermelon, it only gives half those stats, 5%. That would mean you probably want to run with the red eyes glare here. That would give 5% power to cap the power, but still the undead ring is far better than just 5% power. Otherwise, we are of course using our Wildstorm elixir along with our flasks of potency. Wildstorm elixir gives our crit severity and crit strike rating, and the Flask of Potency gives crit strike rating, power rating, accuracy rating, and also 5% crit severity, which is mainly what you use it for. And let's not forget about those overloads. Of course, we're using Rage of Flames, 5% total damage bonus, and also Devil's Precision, 5% crit chance, and 5% accuracy. Otherwise, you can use some Guild Stronghold food if you really want to as well, along with some potions, still figuring out if they actually work. These potions of dragon slaying, along with scrolls of protection from dragons. In the phase 1 of the trial, they do not seem to work, but it's rumored they work in the later phases when Valindra is separated from the dragon. And overall, that is my build. So it should be all broken into sections in the video progress bar down below, and otherwise there's timestamps in the description. So you should be able to navigate back to any of the following sections if you wish to do so. This build can deal out considerable amounts of damage in this new module, especially in that new trial. So again, hopefully this build is somewhat helpful to you guys, and if I presented as well, consider leaving the video a like. And if you're new around here, consider subscribing. We'll see you guys around. Bye for now.